The entire Faircrest Ballroom was ready to condemn Margaret Byrne. Sean Kavanagh placed a route log on the table carrying her authorization code. Time-stamped 11 minutes before the ambush that killed Marcus Feld and left Dominic Moretti bleeding in the back seat. Anthony Vale whispered that he had always known something was wrong with her. Both families watched the quiet driver in the emerald gown as if the verdict had already been decided. But Dominic did not order her taken away. He knew one thing the room did not. Maggie trusted no single copy of anything that could get someone killed. She opened her clutch, set a second drive beside Sean's evidence, and exposed the flaw in his perfect frame-up, the untouched, onboard backup. It showed the file had been altered that afternoon and traced the leak to Petey Ruiz, a Moretti driver secretly selling schedules to the Kavanaghs. Then Sean turned to his father and spoke the sentence that transformed suspicion into confession. Margaret Byrne had been driving Dominic Moretti for 5 years. And in all that time, he had never called her anything but Byrne. She was 29 years old, 5'7", a size 20 in the gray blazer she wore like a uniform, and 245 pounds. She had stopped apologizing for the day she came home from Kandahar. 4 years in an army transportation company had taught her 3 things that never left her: how to read a road before it turned into a kill box, how to keep her hands steady when everyone else's were shaking, and how to disappear into a room so completely that men twice her rank forgot she was standing in it. It was that last skill the Moretti family valued most, though none of them would have said so out loud. Boston in late autumn ran gray and wet along the waterfront, the kind of cold that settled into a person's joints and stayed there until spring. And Maggie had learned to dress for it the same way she dressed for everything else in this job, practically. Invisibly. In the plain gray blazers and sensible flats she bought 3 of at a time, so she never had to think about the choice twice. It was armor, though she would not have called it that out loud to anyone. Not even Ruth. A woman who took up as much space as Maggie did learned early that the less attention her clothing drew, the more attention her competence got to keep. She drove Dominic to funerals, to hospital wings, to a wedding that wasn't his, and a christening that nearly ended in a shooting. And not once in 5 years had he asked her a single question that wasn't about the route. That did not mean he hadn't noticed her. He knew she kept a roll of peppermints in the console without being told, because he rubbed his jaw when his stomach was in knots, and she'd clocked the habit in her second week. He knew she hummed off-key to the oldies station when she thought the partition glass hid the sound. Always the same 3 bars of the same forgotten song. And he had never once told her to stop. He knew about the medallion. It hung from her keyring, a St. Christopher worn smooth and dented on one edge. The only thing she'd kept of her grandfather's besides his temper. And she touched it with 2 fingers every single time before she turned the engine over. A habit so old she no longer noticed herself doing it. Dominic noticed. Dominic noticed everything about the people who kept him alive. Because a man in his position who stopped noticing was a man already dead. And he told himself that was the only reason he watched her the way he did the set of her shoulders. The exact pressure she used on the brake. The way she never once flinched at the things she overheard in the back seat. He was 34 that year. Built like the bespoke Tom Ford suits he never once wore casually. Dark hair going faintly gray at the temples. A jaw sharp enough that photographs of him rarely looked like the man in the room. And eyes the specific icy blue that made grown men in this business forget what they'd come to say. The scars on his knuckles had stories nobody asked him to tell. And he never offered them. The same way he never explained why a man who ran half the Boston waterfront still checked twice that every door in his penthouse was locked before he let himself sleep. He told himself a great many things about why he watched her. And none of them were the truth. Because a man like him had learned a long time ago that he only knew how to destroy soft things. And he had decided years earlier that Margaret Byrne would not become one more name on that list. The Moretti garage, underneath a converted textile mill on the Fort Point waterfront, ran on a hierarchy so old nobody bothered to write it down anymore. And at the bottom of every unwritten hierarchy, there is always someone whose job it is to make the newest, smallest cruelties feel normal. For the Moretti family, that job fell to men like Anthony Vale, a mid-level capo's nephew with more opinions than assignments, who liked to lean against the wall by the coffee machine and comment, just loud enough, on whichever driver he'd decided to torment that week. Byrne's gonna need her own zip code for that uniform soon, he said one Tuesday morning. To the two men beside him who laughed, because laughing at Anthony Vale was easier than not laughing at Anthony Vale. Maggie didn't look up from the clipboard where she was logging the morning's tire pressure. Because she had learned in the army that the men who needed you to react were the same men who had nothing else to hold over you. She wrote down the numbers, closed the folder, and walked past all three of them close enough that Anthony had to step back. And something about the way she didn't so much as glance at him made him laugh a little too hard to cover it. Dominic came down the stairwell in time to hear the tail end of it. And he said nothing. Because saying something in front of the men would have made it about his temper instead of about her. And instead he filed Anthony Vale's name away in the specific part of his memory, reserved for debts that would be collected eventually. At a time of his own choosing. That was the world Maggie Byrne lived in for 5 years, invisible enough to be mocked. Indispensable enough to be trusted with the Dawn's life every single morning, and she had made a kind of peace with the arrangement. Because the alternative, the world before the army and before the Morettis, had not been kinder to her, only louder about it. Maggie's closest thing to a friend inside the organization was Ruth Delgado, 61 years old, who had driven for Dominic's father before Dominic was born and had earned, through 2 decades of loyalty, the rare privilege of saying whatever she wanted to whoever she wanted. Ruth had trained Maggie those first few months, back when the job still felt like borrowed ground. And it was Ruth who'd told her, flatly, over coffee in the garage break room, that the trick to surviving in this family wasn't toughness. It was patience. Dressed up to look exactly like toughness, so nobody bothered checking twice. They'll test you for about a year, Ruth had said. Then they'll forget you're a person at all. Which is the whole point. And that's when you're actually safe. Ruth had been right about almost everything since. And it was Ruth, not Dominic, who noticed first that something in the pattern had shifted the way Dominic lingered by the car, 2 extra minutes some mornings. The way he'd started asking the dispatcher for Maggie by name instead of just requesting a driver. Ruth never said anything about it directly. She only raised an eyebrow over her thermos some mornings, in a way that made Maggie's ears go warm and made her check the tire pressure twice instead of once. Just to have somewhere to put her hands. What Ruth didn't know, because Maggie had never told anyone at the garage, was that Dominic had quietly covered the difference on her mother's nursing home bill for 8 months running, routed through a payroll adjustment that HR never questioned, because nobody questioned anything. Dominic Moretti signed off on personally. She'd found out by accident. Going over the family's expense ledgers the way her old training told her, always to double-check anything with her name attached to it. And she'd never brought it up to him, because some kindnesses, she'd learned, were worth more left unacknowledged than turned into a debt either of them had to carry out loud. Off the clock. Her life was small and mostly her own, a 1-bedroom apartment in Dorchester with a second-hand recliner older than she was. A Sunday phone call with her mother she never missed, no matter which city the job took her to. And a body she'd stopped measuring against anyone else's expectations somewhere around her second tour. Because a person who has carried another soldier's weight across a 110-degree afternoon does not spend much time worrying whether a size 20 looks acceptable in a company blazer. She liked herself. It had taken her the better part of a decade to get there. And she had no intention of handing that back to Anthony Vale or anyone like him, no matter how loudly they laughed by the coffee machine. She was folding herself into that peace. Small and careful. The morning everything changed. The change arrived 9 days before a dinner nobody in the organization wanted to attend, in the form of a single phone call that Dominic took standing at his office window with his back to the room. And when he turned around, his face had the specific stillness Maggie had learned, over 5 years, to read as worse than shouting. The Kavanaugh family wanted the port contract that had belonged to the Morettis since before Dominic was born. And for 2 years they had wanted it quietly, through lawyers and zoning boards and a slow, grinding campaign that Dominic's father would have called beneath him. Now Cormac Kavanaugh, old and tired of quiet, had proposed a sit-down, a peace summit, his lawyers called it, at the Faircrest Hotel Ballroom in 9 days' time, and everyone in the Moretti organization understood that a Kavanaugh peace summit was a chess move, not an olive branch. Dominic told Leo Campbell, his oldest friend, and the only man he trusted with both his schedule and his doubts, to double every security detail and change every fixed route on the calendar. And Leo, who had known Dominic since they were boys stealing cigarettes from the same corner store, said only, "You think they'll move before the sit-down? I think Cormac's too old to move himself," Dominic said. "And his son isn't." Sean Kavanaugh was 31, quick, where his father was patient, and carried a grudge the way other men carried a wallet close. Constant. And reached for without thinking. 2 days after the summit was announced, Sean showed up at a neutral garage on the edge of Southie to inspect a shipment neither family fully trusted the other with. And Maggie was there because Dominic's car needed a part. The neutral garage happened to stock. And that was the first time she ever stood in the same room as the man who would nearly get her killed. He looked at her, the way Anthony Vale looked at her. Except colder. More deliberate. A man cataloging a weakness rather than enjoying one. "They let her drive the boss," Sean said to the room. "Not to her. The way men like him always spoke about a woman rather than to one. Moretti's slipping if that's the best protection money can buy." Maggie kept her eyes on the invoice she was signing and said nothing. Because the mission in that moment was not her pride. It was information. And information was the one thing 5 years of driving powerful men had taught her to gather without anyone noticing she was gathering it. One of Sean's men laughed too loud at the comment, the way Anthony Vale's audience always did. And Maggie noted that too, not the insult itself, which she had heard in 100 variations from 100 smaller men, but the fact that Sean Kavanaugh had bothered to say it at all in a room meant for business, as if he needed his own men to see him diminish someone before he could feel comfortable standing in Moretti territory. That, more than the insult, told her something true about the kind of man she was dealing with. Sean asked, too casually, whether the Moretti convoy still ran the dock road on Thursdays. A question that had no business coming out of a rival family's mouth unless someone inside the Moretti organization had already told him the answer. And Maggie logged the question the same way she logged tire pressure quietly. Completely. Without a flicker on her face. She told Leo about it that same night. Not Dominic. Because Leo was the one who ran security, and because some part of her, some old habit from a chain of command she'd left behind years ago, still believed in going through the proper channel first. Leo listened, wrote nothing down, and said the words that would matter more than either of them understood, yet nobody outside this family knows our Thursday roots, which meant somebody inside it did. The family held an informal dinner 2 nights after the summit was announced. The kind Dominic's late father used to call a State of the Union, whether anyone wanted to hear one or not. And it was there that Maggie met Dominic's Aunt Carla for the first time in nearly a year. The older woman having spent the winter in Florida and returned just in time to hear about Cormac Kavanaugh's proposal. Carla Moretti was 73. Sharp as a blade left out in the cold. And the only person in the family who had ever addressed Maggie by her first name without being told to. "Margaret," she said, taking both of Maggie's hands in hers at the door. "You look tired. Has my nephew been running you into the ground? Or is it that garage full of little boys who think manners are optional?" Maggie said it was nothing she couldn't handle. And Carla studied her for a moment the way older women who have survived a great deal always study younger women who are trying to convince them of something. "I raised 3 sons in this family," Carla said. "I know exactly which kind of trouble looks like. Nothing you can't handle right up until it isn't. Come find me if that ever changes." It was, Maggie would think later, the first time anyone in 5 years had told her, without being asked, that she was allowed to need help. At the table, the conversation stayed carefully. Technical port tonnage, insurance liabilities. The specific language lawyers on both sides had already begun drafting for the summit agreement, but underneath it ran the older, uglier current. Everyone at that table understood without saying. The Kavanaughs did not propose peace out of exhaustion. They proposed it because peace, dressed up correctly, was sometimes the fastest road to a war nobody saw coming, until it was already inside the house. After the guests left, Dominic asked Leo to run a discreet check on every driver hired in the last 2 years. A request Leo noted down without comment. though both men understood exactly which hires that request was really circling. Dominic found out about Sean Kavanaugh's comment 3 days later. Not from Maggie, who would never have brought it to him herself, but from one of the mechanics who repeated it as a joke he didn't realize wasn't funny. And something in Dominic went very quiet, in a way the mechanic mistook for calm. He found Sean Kavanaugh that same evening at a restaurant on the North End that both families used as neutral ground, sitting with 2 of his men over a bottle of wine he hadn't earned the right to enjoy yet. And Dominic crossed the room alone. No bodyguards. Because a man who needed bodyguards for this particular conversation had already lost it. He didn't raise his voice. He set both hands flat on the table, leaned down until his face was level with Sean's, and said, "You said something about my driver." Sean smiled, the way men like him always smiled when they thought stillness meant safety. "Just an observation. Moretti. No offense." "Say her name," Dominic said. "What? You don't know it," Dominic said. "Because you didn't bother to learn it before you decided she was worth insulting. Her name is Maggie Byrne. She has kept me alive for 5 years, which is longer than your father's. Had the stomach to run his own family without leaning on yours. Say it again in front of me. And I promise you, Sean, it will be the last sentence you ever finish." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out, and the restaurant stayed silent long enough that even Sean's own men wouldn't meet his eyes. And Sean sat there memorizing every word, filing it away the same careful, patient way his father had taught him to file every humiliation the Morettis had ever handed his family. Going back 20 years to a Docklands deal that had cut the Kavanaughs out of the port trade entirely and left Cormac Kavanagh's name off every contract that mattered from that day forward. Sean had been 11 years old the year his father lost the ports. He had grown up watching a promise get broken in a boardroom he wasn't old enough to sit in. And he had decided somewhere in his 20s that he was not owed an apology for it. He was owed what should have been his, by blood. And he intended to take it back before the peace summit ever gave Dominic Moretti the chance to make the arrangement permanent and legal and impossible to undo. He had a man inside the Moretti organization already. Had for 6 months. A junior driver named Petey Ruiz, who owed a debt to a Kavanaugh-run book and had been quietly paying it off in scraps of schedule information nobody thought mattered until they were assembled into a pattern. Sean's mistake, if it could be called that, was believing patience alone would win him the contract. His genuine skill was knowing exactly how to use 6 months of small, boring information to build one perfect window of opportunity. And after Dominic's visit to the restaurant, he decided that window needed to open sooner than planned. The Docklands deal that broke the Kavanaughs, back when Sean was 11, had nothing to do with violence at all. That was the detail Sean carried heaviest. Because a bullet he could have understood. Dominic's father and Cormac Kavanaugh had shaken hands on a 50-50 port arrangement in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon. And by Friday, the paperwork had shifted to 90-10 in the Moretti's favor. Buried in language Cormac's own attorney should have caught, and hadn't. Cormac had signed anyway. Rather than start a war he wasn't sure he could win. And Sean had grown up watching his father carry that signature like a wound that never fully closed. Repeated at every family gathering. Every slight from a Moretti cousin at a wedding. Every year the ports report came out and reminded the Kavanaughs exactly how much smaller their share of the harbor had become. Sean had decided, somewhere around his 25th birthday, that he would not grow old the way his father had, patient, dignified, and poorer for it. He told himself. The night he first paid Petey Ruiz for a schedule, nobody should have sold him. That he was simply finishing an argument his father had lost the stomach to keep having. Dominic. For his part, he had no idea any of this history sat quite so close to the surface of Sean Kavanaugh's temper. He only knew, from 20 years of watching his own father run this family, that a man with an old grievance and a new opportunity was the single most dangerous combination the business produced. If they move, he told Leo that week, they'll move at whoever's closest to me. Not at me directly. Cormac's too smart to start a war he can't finish. But Sean isn't Cormac. Leo looked at him carefully. You mean Byrne? I mean anyone in that car, Dominic said, which both men understood. without either saying so, was not entirely the same thing as an honest answer. Dominic came home that night and found Maggie waiting by the car exactly where she always waited. And for the first time in 5 years, he said something that wasn't about the route. "You should have told me yourself," he said. "About Kavanagh. It wasn't a security matter yet." She said, "It was a garage comment. I've had worse." "That's not the same thing as it being acceptable." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But I've survived worse than acceptable for a long time. Mr. Moretti. And I didn't need you to fight that particular battle for me." He looked at her longer than the moment required, long enough that she felt it, and said, quietly, "I wasn't fighting it for you. I was fighting it because I don't like being reminded that I let it happen in my own garage for 5 years without saying anything." It was the closest either of them had come to admitting the boundary between them had already begun to crack. And neither of them mentioned it again for the rest of the drive home. The ambush came 4 days later. On the Thursday dock road, Sean Kavanagh already knew by heart, though it did not come the way anyone in the Moretti organization expected. Because Petey Ruiz's last piece of information wasn't about the road at all, it was about a route change meant to avoid it. Leo had ordered the Thursday route scrapped that very morning, replacing it with a longer path through the container yards, specifically because the old road felt compromised. And he told exactly 4 people about the change: Dominic, Maggie, himself, and Petey Ruiz, whose clearance nobody had thought to question, because he'd been driving for the family for 2 years without incident. By 4 that afternoon, Sean Kavanagh knew the new route before Maggie had finished loading the trunk. The container yard road ran narrow between 2 rows of stacked freight, a choke point nobody had reinforced because nobody outside the 4 people who knew about it should have been able to use it against them. And Maggie felt it before she saw it. The particular wrongness of empty space where dock workers should have been at that hour. The absence of the usual forklift traffic. A silence that read to her the exact way a cleared village had read to her once. A long time ago. In a different uniform, 2 vehicles back. In the trailing security car, 24-year-old Marcus Feld was thinking about his son's first birthday. 6 weeks away. And a bounce house he still hadn't managed to book, because every rental company in Dorchester seemed to be already reserved for the same Saturday in June. He had no way of knowing that thought would be one of his last ordinary ones. And there was a mercy in that. The same mercy that had spared plenty of good men in plenty of ambushes before him the not knowing. Right up until the knowing arrived far too fast to do anything useful with it. "Something's off," she said, already slowing the Cadillac before Dominic had finished asking what. The first shots came from the container stacks on both sides at once. And the front tire took a hit that would have ended the drive of anyone who hadn't spent 4 years learning to keep a vehicle moving on nothing but instinct and a wheel that no longer wanted to cooperate. Maggie didn't brake. She cut the wheel hard into the skid instead of away from it. Dropped the Cadillac sideways through a gap between 2 container stacks that any rational assessment would have called too narrow, and used the momentum of the near crash to put 3 tons of armored steel between Dominic and the second wave of gunfire before he had time to reach for his own weapon. Dominic threw himself across the back seat and covered her with his body, where the partition glass had already spider-webbed from impact, taking a graze along his upper arm that tore through his suit jacket and would leave him bleeding through the rest of the night a wound. Not a kill shot, but enough to make his jaw go tight with the effort of not making a sound as he pressed his palm against it. He wasn't only shielding her. He had his own sidearm out and fired twice through the shattered rear window at the eastern stack the moment he had an angle. Not because he expected to hit anything at that speed, but because a man in his position who let himself be purely protected, even by someone this good, had already forgotten who he was. "Drive," he said through his teeth. "Don't stop. Whatever you hear, do not stop." She didn't. She read the ambush the way she'd once read, an insurgent kill zone from the driver's seat of an armored truck a lifetime ago, noted where the muzzle flashes clustered thickest, understood in half a second that the gap in gunfire on the eastern stack meant fewer shooters than the western side, and threw the Cadillac toward that gap with a violence that cracked 2 ribs against her own seatbelt and didn't slow her down at all. One of the trailing security vehicles wasn't so lucky. It took the brunt of the ambush head-on. And Marcus, who had joined the family the same year as Maggie, didn't make it out of the container yard. Back at the garage, Leo Campbell was 3 sentences into a phone call about insurance paperwork when the radio channel reserved for convoy emergencies cracked open with gunfire, audible underneath Maggie's voice. And he was out of his chair and reaching for his own weapon before the dispatcher had finished repeating the container yard's location twice. "Get every car we have moving," he said, already running for the stairs. "Now. Not in 5 minutes. Now." It would take Leo's team 6 minutes to reach the yard. 6 minutes that felt, to everyone monitoring that channel in the garage below the old textile mill, like the longest 6 minutes the family had lived through since the year Dominic's father died. Sean Kavanaugh's men had the advantage for nearly 90 seconds, long enough to prove the plan worked, long enough to cost the Morettis a life, long enough that when Maggie finally broke the Cadillac out through the yard's far gate and onto open road, her hands didn't shake and her breathing didn't change. Because that particular kind of stillness under fire was the one thing the Army had never managed to train out of her afterward. No matter how much therapy she'd sat through since, she got them 4 miles clear before she allowed herself to pull over. Checked Dominic's arm with hands that finally trembled once the adrenaline let go. And Radio Leo with a voice flattened by 5 years of practice at sounding calm when nothing about the situation was calm at all. "We're alive," she said. "Marcus isn't. And Mr. Moretti needs a doctor who isn't going to file paperwork with the family name on it." Leo was already moving before she finished the sentence. They didn't take Dominic to a hospital, because a gunshot wound with the Moretti name attached to it would have been in 3 different police reports and 1 tabloid column by morning. And instead, Leo brought a private physician to the penthouse who had stitched worse for less money and asked no questions either time. Maggie stayed the whole night. Not because anyone ordered her to, but because she had field-dressed the wound herself in the back of a moving Cadillac, using nothing but a first aid kit and 4 years of muscle memory. And some quiet. Stubborn part of her refused to leave the job unfinished. Before the physician even arrived, Dominic had made himself do the one thing he dreaded most. He called Marcus's wife, Donna, himself, rather than let Leo or anyone else carry that weight for him. Because a man who let other people deliver his worst news had no business calling himself the head of anything. He didn't tell her over the phone. He only asked, gently, if he could come by within the hour. And Dana, 23 years old, with an 18-month-old asleep down the hall. He had gone very quiet in a way that told him she already half knew before he said a single word, past hello. Leo drove him there himself, refusing Maggie's offer to take the wheel despite the late hour and her own exhaustion. Because some drives, he said, a friend does for another friend, and nobody else. Dominic stayed 40 minutes. He came out of that apartment building looking 10 years older than he had going in. And the only thing he said to Leo in the car afterward was that the family would cover Dana's mortgage and the boy's education. In full. For as long as either of them needed it. And that the arrangement was not up for discussion with the accountants. It was the kind of promise Dominic Moretti made exactly the way his father had taught him to quietly, immediately, and without ever mentioning it again once it was done. Dominic, for his part, had a smaller kindness left in him even that night. One nobody would have thought to notice before heading upstairs to the penthouse. He stopped long enough to press 2 folded hundreds into the hand of the overnight valet, a 19-year-old named Cole, who was working a double to help his mother with rent, and asked after Cole's little sister's tonsil surgery by name, because for all the ice in Dominic Moretti's reputation, he made a point of remembering the people whose names most men in his position never bothered to learn in the first place. It was a smaller thing than a mortgage payment, and it mattered anyway, in the way small things do. It was past 2 in the morning when the physician left, and Dominic, arm bandaged and jacket discarded, finally let himself sit still long enough for the adrenaline to fully drain out of him. And it left behind something rawer than either of them expected. Marcus had a kid, he said, staring at nothing. 18 months old. I'm going to have to be the one who tells his wife. I know, Maggie said. I'm sorry. Don't, he said. Don't apologize for a thing you spent 90 seconds fixing while 3 men tried to kill both of us. You got us out. You got me out. I've done it before, she said, quieter than she meant to. In the army, there was a driver before me, Dominic said, and it came out slower than anything else he'd said all night. Like the words had to be pried loose from somewhere he didn't visit often. Frank Dolan, my father's driver. And mine. Before I was old enough to drive myself. I was 19, the year someone put a bomb under the car meant for my father. And Frank started the engine that morning instead of waiting for him. Because that was Frank's job. Starting the car first. Every single time. So nobody important ever had to. He didn't finish the sentence. And he didn't have to. I never let another driver close after that. He said instead. Kept every one of them at exactly the distance a job requires, and nothing more. For 15 years. And I told myself that was smart management and not something else entirely. And now I spent the last 4 hours more afraid of losing you than I've been of anything since the funeral I gave Frank instead of a birthday present. He said, That's not smart management. Byrne. That's not anything I have a name for. It was the most Maggie had ever heard him say about anyone who wasn't a business associate. And she recognized. In the specific, careful way, he wouldn't look at her while he said it. That she was being shown something he didn't hand out on purpose. Ever. To anyone, which was exactly why she didn't reach for him yet. Not until he'd said the rest of it out loud. I'm not going to be your Frank, she said. The one you protect by keeping at a distance until it's too late to say anything that matters. No, he agreed. You're not. Then don't just tell me you were afraid. Tell me what you actually want. Out loud. The way you'd say it to anyone else you weren't afraid of losing. He looked at her for a long moment. And something in his face that had been braced for 5 years finally let go. I want you somewhere I can see you that isn't the front seat, he said. I want the men who laughed at Anthony Vale's jokes to watch you walk into a room on my arm instead of past it with a clipboard. He stopped. Exhaled. Started again like a man rebuilding a sentence from the studs up. I want to stop pretending the only thing I noticed about you for 5 years was how well you drive. I've spent 5 years watching you decide everyone's distance for them, she said, quieter now. And I need you to understand that I'm not asking for a promotion out of the front seat. I'm asking if you can actually stand next to me without flinching every time somebody like Anthony Vale opens his mouth. I stopped flinching a long time ago, he said. I just didn't let myself say so. Say so now. I want you, he said. Plainly. The way he said things that mattered to men across a negotiating table and had never once said to a woman he meant it about. And I want the whole family to know it. And I want to stop pretending that watching you for 5 years was ever about the driving. That's better, she said, and let herself, finally, close the distance between them. Later, much later, she would remember that even in the exhaustion and the relief and the first real kiss, either of them allowed themselves in 5 years of careful distance. Some part of him never stopped watching the door, not out of fear for himself. She understood now. But because a man who had lost Frank Dolan to a moment of not watching had built his whole life around, never letting it happen to someone he loved again. The Faircrest Hotel ballroom filled with both families 5 nights later. Chandeliers, throwing hard gold light over round tables set for a piece nobody in the room fully believed in. And Maggie walked in on Dominic's arm wearing an emerald green gown that Leo's tailor had delivered that afternoon, with a note that said only, "From Dominic. In case anyone in that room forgets who kept you alive." At her throat sat a necklace Dominic had chosen himself 2 days earlier. Standing in a jeweler's back room he'd never once visited for himself. An emerald-cut stone set in gold that cost more than most of the men in that ballroom made in a year. And when the jeweler asked what occasion called for something this fine, Dominic had said only, the kind where somebody finally gets to see her properly. Maggie had argued against wearing it. Said it was too much. And Dominic had told her, simply, that after 5 years of teaching an entire garage to look past her, one night of being impossible to look past was the very least he owed her. Anthony Vale saw her first. And whatever joke had been sitting on his tongue for 5 years died somewhere before it reached his mouth. Because the woman crossing that ballroom floor in emerald silk, on the Don's arm, he was not someone whose clipboard anyone was going to laugh about again. Cormac Kavanagh opened the evening with the kind of speech that used the word peace 4 times and meant it perhaps once. And Sean sat beside his father with the particular stillness of a man who believed his best move had already been played and had simply not detonated yet. It detonated sooner than he wanted. Because Maggie had spent the 4 days since the ambush doing the one thing nobody at that table expected a driver to do, she had pulled the Cadillac's onboard route logs, cross-referenced every recorded route change against exactly who had access to the day's schedule, and rebuilt, hour by hour, a paper trail that led in one direction only. Leo stood first, before the appetizers had even cleared, and asked the room's permission to raise a security matter. And Dominic granted it with a stillness that made half the Kavanagh table shift in their seats. 4 people knew about the container yard route before the ambush. Leo said, myself, Mr. Moretti, Ms. Byrne, and Petey Ruiz, who's been driving for this family for 2 years. Petey, 3 tables back, went the color of the tablecloth. We pulled the phone records this morning, Leo said. 6 months of payments to a book that answers to exactly one family in this room. Sean didn't flinch the way a guilty man should have. Instead, he reached into his jacket, unhurried, and set his own folder on the table with the calm of a man who had planned for exactly this moment. Since we're sharing documents, he said, perhaps the room should see this. A route log, timestamped this afternoon, showing Miss Byrne herself authorizing the container yard change 11 minutes before the ambush began. My people pulled it the moment I heard whispers of tonight's little performance. A murmur went through both tables at once. And for one long, ugly moment, it worked exactly the way Sean had built it to work. Anthony Vale, 3 tables back, muttered something to his neighbor that ended in, always knew there was something off about her. And even a few of Cormac's own capos nodded slowly, willing to believe the version of the story that made a woman in an emerald gown the villain, instead of the son of the man they answered to. Dominic's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet, because he had learned a long time ago that the worst mistake in a room like this was defending someone before they'd had the chance to defend themselves. And Maggie Byrne had never once needed anyone to speak for her. That's a good forgery, Maggie said, into the murmur, loud enough to cut through it without raising her voice at all. Whoever built it even got my authorization code right. But they made one mistake. And it's the same mistake every amateur makes with a log file. They forgot the backup. She reached into the small clutch Leo's tailor had insisted on, the one she'd argued against carrying all evening, and set a second drive on the table beside Sean's folder. I have the original onboard log, she said. And every head in the ballroom turned toward the driver in the emerald gown as though noticing, for the first time, that she had a voice at all. Not the copy that somebody tried to alter this afternoon to make it look like I ordered the route change myself. The original. Army habit. You always keep a second backup. Nobody else knows exists. Stored somewhere nobody thinks to look for it. She set the drive on the table in front of Cormac Kavanagh, close enough that he had to look at it, and said, quietly, without a trace of the invisibility she'd worn for 5 years, your son tried to make it my name on that report. Mr. Kavanagh. He nearly had this whole room believing it. He just wasn't fast enough to stop me from keeping the original. Sean's genuinely clever play, the doctored log, planted that very afternoon through Petey's last piece of access. Designed to end the evening with Margaret Byrne disgraced and discredited, instead of him had worked. For almost 90 full seconds of murmuring doubt around that ballroom. Right up until the exact moment it didn't. And the gap between those two things was the difference between the son Cormac Kavanagh had raised and the son he'd apparently failed to teach patience. Cormac Kavanagh looked at the drive, then at his son, and something old and tired and finally, fully disappointed, settled over his face. You did this without my knowledge, he said. And it wasn't a question. Someone had to finish what you were too old to finish, Sean said. And the words landed in that ballroom the way a confession always lands, once it's already too late to take back. You cost a man his life, Dominic said, standing now, quiet in the exact way that had made Sean's own men go silent weeks earlier in that North End restaurant. Marcus Feld was 24. He had a wife and a son 18 months old. You are going to explain that to his family yourself, Sean, in writing, in your own hand. And then you are going to learn exactly how patient my family can be when it wants something back. Cormac didn't argue. He stood, straightened his jacket with the particular dignity of an old man watching his legacy collapse in real time, and said only, "Take him home. We'll discuss the ports another day. Dominic, when my son isn't in the room to embarrass either of our families further." Petey Ruiz didn't get the luxury of a father to walk him out. Two of Leo's men did that instead. Quietly, before the band even had the chance to start again. And Leo watched him go with the particular flatness of a man filing away a betrayal for later. The way the Moretti family always did. Patiently and completely. Somewhere behind Dominic, one of the older capos who had worked under his father began, quietly, to clap. And the sound spread through the Moretti tables, the way relief always spreads, once a threat has been named and defeated in the same breath. Dominic turned to the room, to the men from his own garage, who had spent 5 years mistaking a plain gray blazer for something unremarkable, and said, loud enough that every table heard it, "Ms. Byrne rebuilt an ambush from memory. Drove 3 tons of armored steel through a gap most of you wouldn't have tried in a stunt film. And just handed Cormac Kavanagh the evidence that saved this entire peace agreement from collapsing tonight. Anyone in this family who still has a joke about her uniform can bring it to me directly." Nobody did. Anthony Vale, from 3 tables back, found something extremely interesting to study on the surface of his wine glass. Dana Feld moved with her son to a smaller, sturdier house in Quincy that same month. The mortgage handled exactly the way Dominic promised it would be. And she sent Maggie a single card that read only, "Thank you for bringing him home as far as you could," which Maggie kept folded in the same drawer as her grandfather's old dog tags, because some debts were not the kind you paid off, only the kind you carried carefully. Ruth Delgado, for her part, took one look at the emerald gown hanging in the garage's spare locker the morning after the summit and said nothing at all, which from Ruth was the loudest possible approval anyone in that garage had ever received. 6 weeks later, the port contract signed, and Cormac Kavanagh's family quietly restructured under new, more patient leadership. Maggie still drove the Cadillac most mornings, because she liked the wheel under her hands and had no intention of giving that up for a desk. But she no longer sat behind the partition glass alone. Dominic rode up front now, when the schedule allowed it, which surprised exactly no one who had watched the ballroom that night and understood what had actually shifted. The dented St. Christopher medallion still hung from her key ring, except now it hung beside a second one, small and new, engraved on the back in Dominic's own handwriting, with 4 words he'd had etched into the gold the week after the summit. Still watching every mirror, she touched both of them, 2 fingers, every time before she turned the engine over, and he had stopped pretending he didn't notice the habit, because pretending not to notice things about Margaret Byrne had never once, in 5 years, been something he was actually good at. "You know," she said one morning, pulling out of the garage while Anthony Vale very deliberately found somewhere else to be. "The men used to bet on how long I'd last." "I know," Dominic said. "I used to let them, because I didn't think I was allowed to say anything about it without giving away exactly how much I'd already noticed you." And now he reached over, laced his fingers through hers on the gear shift, and said it the way he'd promised himself he would say it from now on, out loud, to the one person in 5 years who had never once needed him to prove anything to deserve it. "Now I want the whole city to know exactly how badly they underestimated you." Anthony Vale, for what it was worth, had put in for a transfer to the family's Providence office 2 weeks after the summit, and nobody at the Fort Point garage pretended not to know exactly why, or missed him even a little once he was gone. So if a man spent 5 years learning every mirror, every habit, every quiet thing about a woman he told himself he'd never let himself have, and it still wasn't enough to stop him from nearly losing her in a container yard on a Thursday afternoon, what does that tell you about the ones we convince ourselves we can watch from a safe distance forever? If this story got your pulse up, even half as much as it got ours, smash that like button before you go, because it tells us exactly which stories to bring you next. Share this one with the friend who always says the quiet ones never see it coming, because Margaret Byrne certainly did. And if you want more nights from the shadows of this family, subscribe and ring the bell, because Boston isn't finished with the Morettis yet.